Good afternoon, and welcome to the installation of Dr. Pablo Fajgelbaum to the Dubchansky Endowed Chair in Economics. I'm Darnell Hunt, Dean of Social Sciences at UCLA. It is my pleasure to thank Scott and Lori Dubchansky, both of whom are Bruins, for the establishment of this endowed chair, which is critical to retaining and recruiting our top economics faculty. Scott, who earned his bachelor's degree in economics, and Lori, who earned her bachelor's degree in psychology, are engaged and valued members of the UCLA community. We are grateful for their generosity and continued involvement with the college and the Department of Economics. My congratulations to Pablo Fajgelbaum on becoming the inaugural holder of the Dubchansky Endowed Chair in Economics. Pablo is most deserving of this wonderful honor. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dora Costa, Chair and Professor of Economics.
Thank you, Darnell. On behalf of the Economics Department, it is my pleasure to thank Scott and Lori Dubchansky for the Dubchansky Endowed Chair in Economics. UCLA Economics has many strengths. We are a faculty deeply committed to economics and to using economics to understand the world. We are a young and dynamic department, and we are an intellectually diverse department spanning many fields, ranging from antitrust to finance to macroeconomics to personnel economics to taxation to health and international and regional economics. In a very short period of time, the department grew one of the top groups in international economics in the country. Pablo Fajgelbaum, our inaugural chairholder, is one of the stars of the International and Regional Economics Group. Pablo Fajgelbaum joined UCLA in 2011 as an assistant professor after receiving his PhD from Princeton that same year. We quickly tenured Pablo and promoted him to full professor in 2020. Pablo is a wonderful example of the department's ability to spot and nurture talent. In a short period of time, he compiled a research record that is the envy of the profession and was named a Sloan Research Fellow in 2017. Pablo also is a dedicated advisor of his PhD students. We are deeply grateful to Scott and Lori Dubchansky for providing us with the Dubchansky Endowed Chair in Economics. While the department is outstanding at spotting and nurturing talent, keeping talent in a competitive environment is much harder. Chairs provide us with the means to compete. Pablo is on leave this academic year and will be on leave next academic year. We are especially grateful to him for returning to us virtually for this celebration. I will now turn it over to Pablo.
Thank you very much, Darnell and Dora, for the kind introduction. And of course, thank you, Scott and Lori Dubchansky, for your generosity. In fact, the research I will talk about was done at UCLA during the first year I received the chair. So thank you for your generous support. So today I will talk about impacts of the US-China trade war. And let me introduce by saying something that perhaps you already know, which is that for the great part of the 20th century, the US was a champion of global economic integration. But this approach came to a grinding halt around early 2018. What happened in that period was that first the US increased tariffs on a series of consumer products, such as washing machines, and other specific items, such as solar panels, and most notably, steel. This first wave of tariffs was continued over time with further tariffs that didn't target specific products, but actually target China as a country. In response to this increase in US tariffs on specific products first and then on China as a country, the main trade partners of the US, Russia, Canada, Mexico, and the European Union, and of course later China, retaliated against the US. So this process of the US imposing tariffs on its main trade partners and China retaliating against the US continued for the great part of 2019. And today, the tariffs remain pretty high. About 60% of China-US trade is currently subject to tariffs that are about 20%. And in contrast, the US and China have tariffs on the rest of the world, that is on all the other countries, that are much lower, that are between 3 and 6%, which are the numbers that they have had for some time before the trade war against each other as well. So this is the context for what I'm going to talk about. And I guess, needless to say, this was the biggest return to protectionism that the US experienced since the 1930 Smoot-Hawley Act, which increased protection in response to the Great Depression, triggering several years of very high tariffs. Now, let me show you some information about these tariffs. Let me show you some data about how these tariffs look like. These are the tariffs that the US imposed on the rest of the world. These were the first tariffs that I mentioned: solar panels, washing machines, then aluminum and iron and steel. And what I want to highlight here is how broad and how important these waves were, and how they increase over time. So this first set of tariffs only targeted a few products. These are called HS10. This is the jargon for the classification in which international trade products are denominated. But then you can see that over time, as the US imposed more and more tariffs, a greater number of products was covered. You can think of a product as, for example, a particular type of washing machine, all the way to about 18,000 specific products being covered by these tariffs. What we see in this column is the value of US import and the percentage of the total imports that's covered by each of these waves. And by and large, the biggest wave corresponds to, or the biggest sort of waves are those that correspond to China, that span the period from July 18 to September 2019. By the end of this sustained increase in tariffs, we have that about 18% of the total imports of the US were covered by these tariffs, which increased from a 3%, around 3% in 2017 before the trade war, to about 26% in the post-war era. The value of this tariff is about $20 billion. The other thing I want to highlight is how broad they are in terms of the range of sectors that they cover. And we have here a classification of pretty much every tradable sector, from agriculture to chemicals, machinery, and transport, just to name a few. And what you see in this graph is the value of the tariff increases that the US imposed on China in blue, and that the US imposed on other countries in red. You can see in these lines, the length of these lines is capturing the variance or the dispersion of these tariffs across different products within a sector. This is showing you that there was some product within machinery, some machine, that was taxed for up to a 20% increase relative to its pre-trade war value, and others were lower. And these black dots is the average increase in the tariff in each of these sectors. And you can see this very broad dispersion, and particularly the coverage of these tariffs across many sectors in the economy. Machinery was perhaps one of the most representative sectors, the one in which the US set some of the biggest tariffs increases. And of course, we have, in response to the US tariffs, the retaliation tariffs, or the retaliatory tariffs, as they are called. What do we see in this table is the different waves of retaliation against the US. The first countries to retaliate were Mexico, Turkey, the European Union, and then later on, China. And we also see this pattern of increasing strength in these retaliatory waves, to the point that by the end, we have that about 8,000 products that the US exports being taxed by the trade partners of the US. In total, these products account for about 9% of the total exports of the US, for a tariff increase that went from about 8% to 20%. So this is the background. The US for a long time championed global economic integration. This process stopped by early 2018. The US imposed tariffs mostly on China, and China retaliated against the US, representing the biggest return to protectionism since the 1930s. So what I will talk about today is research that with co-authors I've done in this paper called The Return to Protectionism, published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics last year. We do several things in this paper, and I want to give you essentially the headlines and the main results of what we do. And we can split our research into two main parts. The first one, and the one I will dedicate most of the time, has to do with the aggregate effects of the trade war or the tariff war between the US and China on the aggregate real income of the US. And the second part is about the regional effects of the trade war, that is, how the tariffs differentially affected regions across the US counties in particular. And at that point, I will focus the question on how these regional effects correlated or related to the political leaning of the different counties. That is, how counties that were oriented Republican or Democrat to different degrees in the 2016 election were affected differentially or exposed differentially to these tariffs. Of course, the trade war is a multi-phased phenomenon. There are many things that one could study beyond what I'm going to tell you. It will be very interesting to look at effects in other countries or many more outcomes than what I'm going to tell you about. So you can think of this as sort of a big picture, sort of first step into trying to understand some of the key outcomes from the perspective of our economic analysis. So let's jump into it. And I think that before showing you any number and any outcome of what happened, I think it's important to do kind of a brief conceptual review of tariffs. Many of you will find this familiar, and for some of you, this will be sort of a reminder of things that you may have studied some years ago. So what are tariffs? So tariffs are the main instrument or the canonical instrument in trade policy. They are a tax on imports. In practice, it's something that the buyer of the importer is paying to the federal US government in this case. So what's the effect of the tariff? In order to compute the aggregate effect on real income, which is what we are interested in computing, we need to break down this effect into the effects of the different agents in the economy. And particularly, we can divide it into an effect on consumers and an effect on producers. Well, consumers should intuitively be worse off. Think about before the tariff, you are buying some import of a consumer product from China, you are paying some price, which is the export price from China. That is the price that the Chinese exporters receive. And then the tariff comes and you have to pay that price plus some extra tax that goes to the government. So for the consumer of the good, and here I'm using consumer in sort of a broad sense, this can be a household that is indirectly importing by buying in a retailer, or this can be a firm that is directly importing some input from China. So for all these consumers, as I'm calling them, there is an increase in the cost of these imports. And how big is this increase in the cost? I mean, when we want to measure this for the aggregate economy, well, a simple sort of back of the envelope type of calculation, a very simple calculation that is typically done by economists, is to simply say, well, let's calculate what's the value of the total imports that the economy was doing before the trade war and multiply that by the increase in the import prices, that is by the increase in these costs. And here I should make a bit of a subtle, perhaps, qualification that when I say import prices, I'm talking about a price that has two components. One component is the export price that the Chinese receive. And then there is another component that is that price plus, or there is a second component, which is the tariff itself. So the total price that the importer is paying is the import price from China plus the tariff. So the total cost that the consumers are paying, that I just described, will depend in part on whether, as a result of the tariff, which will lead consumers to import less, if as a result of the tariff, the Chinese are actually lowering the price at which they are selling to the US. And this is one of the traditional channels through which economists believe that a country may have incentives to impose tariffs, sort of in the same way that a monopsonist or a big firm inside a country may have incentives to buy less of a particular input in order to pressure the supplier to lower the price. When a country has market power in international markets, by incentivizing its importers to buy less from the rest of the world, then it may pressure exporters to lower the price at which they sell. Therefore, the total effect on consumers depends on how much the total cost increases, but perhaps this increasing cost is mitigated by the fact that the exporter, in this case China, to the US may be lowering the price. So that's the story for consumers. What's the story for producers? Well, as consumers import less, they are reallocating into the domestic market. So American producers will benefit. There will be less import competition, less import penetration into the domestic market, and there will be higher demand from American consumers for American goods. This will push up demand for American-made products. This will increase the price of American products and potentially may end up increasing the price of exports. I mean, if the producers can sell to the Americans at a higher price, they will as well export at higher prices. So by the end, the tariffs may end up increasing the wages in the US, and they may have increasing. They may end up increasing the unit value or the prices of the US exports, a phenomenon that is known as a terms of trade improvement. And finally, dancing around, what we have in the process not only is the consumers paying more for imports and the producers perhaps benefiting from higher prices for what they sell, we have the government revenue. We have the fact that the consumers are paying these tariffs to the government. In reality, when we do what happens with this tariff revenue, well, the government may use it for many things. When we do our calculations, we assume that this tariff revenue, in a sense, is rebated back to the American families, which is something that in reality partly happened as the trade war was unfolded. Part of the money corresponding equivalently to tariff revenue was pumped back into the economy in the form of different support for different injured agents, mostly farmers. Something I should add in the context of these different forces is that by how much the producers benefit will obviously depend also on the retaliations. If, as a response to the tariffs set by a country, in this case the US, then the trade partner, in this case China, retaliates, this will operate in a way that mirrors the benefits that the US tariffs have on the American producers. When the Chinese retaliate, they increase the tariffs on American producers, and then the Chinese consumers reallocate away from the American producers, and this causes a lower price for the American producers to be received, partly perhaps offsetting the initial effects of the tariffs. And it's, of course, this sequence of retaliation and counter-retaliation, one of the main reasons that even though countries may have incentives to impose tariffs unilaterally, there may be gains from coordinating into an equilibrium in which countries do not want to do that and coordinate on having mutually lower tariffs. That's one of the reasons economists think that organizations such as the World Trade Organization exist, is in order to keep the tariffs low across the board, so that countries do not get into this game of sort of try to increase tariffs and retaliate against each other. So in sum, we have all these forces. The tariff is a tax on imports. Consumers will lose because they have to pay more, but how much will depend on whether the exporter, in this case China, lowers the price at which they sell to the country. Producers should be better off, but by how much it will depend on the extent to which there are retaliations against the producers coming from the rest of the world. And it is in fact a theorem from neoclassical economics that there are gains to the country, to the US to the US as a whole, if the import prices before the tariffs fall relative to the export prices. If by the end of the day, speaking plainly, the US manages to buy stuff more cheaply than it did before the trade war. And as I mentioned, this is exactly the analogy with how a monopsonist or a monopolist behaves. Inside an economy, a monopsonist has incentive to buy less in order to lower prices, or a monopolist has an incentive to sell less in order to increase the prices, the same way a country has incentives to restrict exports a bit in order to increase the prices. Of course, within a country, when a firm does that, then the customers may be worse off, or the suppliers may be worse off, which is a rationale for antitrust law and so on. But in an international context, absent any control over these efforts of countries, then the benefit to one country will be the loss of another country, but the country that is imposing these tariffs may in the end benefit from this. Okay, so this was my background. I hope this wasn't too wordy. So what I wanna tell you now is the outcomes of what we found in terms of what happened to each of these things that I've been talking about: trade, values, and unit values, and prices, and so on. So I will be showing you a bunch of figures, and these figures have this structure. In the horizontal axis, we have months relative to the time of the tariff enactment. So 0 here will be the moment in which a tariff increases. And there were many events of tariff increases in the data, as I showed you before. Perhaps to focus idea, we can focus, or to just to make this presentation simple, we can imagine that 0 was the time of the biggest tariff increase that the US imposed on China, which was in September of 2018. In September of 2018 was the biggest wave. So you can think of 0 as September of 2018. Even though, to be clear, 0 here means any time that the tariff increases, what happened on average before and after, with different outcomes. And these outcomes are what I'm going to show you. The change in these outcomes is what I'm going to show you in this vertical axis. So what am I showing you here? I'm showing you the total value of imports. So around each time that the US imposed tariffs, and in particular in September 2018, we had that there was at the moment, in the month in which the tariffs increased, a big reduction in the total value of imports. This is the, these are just the dollars that the US is spending in total imports. In particular, this decrease, which was 20% on impact and then went even further to up to 40%, is by how much the US reduced its purchases from the countries on which the tariffs were imposed, namely China, relative to other countries. So you should think of this as take a product, think of a particular consumer product, a computer, that receive a tariff. And then here what we are saying is that by imposing the tariff, imports from China fell between 20 and 40% relative to imports from other countries that were not being taxed directly. So this is just to say, well, these tariffs did have an effect. They had a big effect on how much the US was importing from the targeted country, which was China. And we see that this effect was quite persistent. I mean, we only have data here up to 12 months after each of these events. But again, coming to September 2018, this will be September 2019. Of course, we could continue the analysis further. We know that something really big happened in 2020. So this feels like perhaps decades ago. It was just last year. But so it will be perhaps a bit unclear to continue this analysis further because other very big shocks related to the pandemic start to kick in the data. So we stop it here. And then, but we see that even a year later, you see this big decrease with the tariffs still in place, as I mentioned. So now imports fell. Now let's look at what happened with what I mentioned is the main outcome that we care about to think about welfare, which is prices. And what I'm showing you here is the same figure for the export prices from China. These are the prices before the tariff. That is the prices that the Chinese exporters of a given product, in my example was computers, are receiving relative to the prices that other exporters, like non-Chinese exporters of that product, are receiving. And what we see here, pretty much nothing. So we see that this is flat. What does it mean? It means that even though the US is buying much less, China is not lowering the export prices to the US. We can speculate about why this is happening. And we can have different explanations for that. Technological explanations that have to do perhaps with the easy capacity of production in China to reallocate into other sectors, or perhaps China can sell in other places, or perhaps goods are being reallocated away from China and exported to the US from other destinations. But the point here is that these prices from China are not falling. As I mentioned before, this was one of the main determinants of the magnitude of the fall. or the potential gains for the US. If these prices are not falling, then it will be very hard for the US as a whole to gain, to be better off from these tariffs. Of course, if the prices are not falling, the prices that the Chinese exporters are receiving, then it means that the tariff inclusive price that the US consumer is paying is increasing pretty much one-to-one with the tariffs. This is what's referred to as complete pass-through. That is the pass-through, the rate at which the tariffs are passing through to the prices that the importers are paying, is increasing pretty much one-to-one. All in all, this means that the US importers are going to be worse off. They are paying much more for these goods. And I should be clear that these are really prices at the port. This is the price that an importer pays at the port. Then most households will buy stuff in retailers. And then there is a division of this surplus or this loss between the retailer and the household. I'm talking here what happens at the port that involves sort of the combination of all the buyers of these goods that that are different agents within the economy. So this is what happened with trade. So imports fell a lot, but the export prices from China did not, and the tariffs actually passed through to the import price one-to-one. We can take this data and make a very simple calculation of the cost to consumers. The first item of my aggregate real income effect. Take how much the US was importing relative to GDP before the trade war, about 15%. About 17% of these imports are targeted by some tariff, and on average, weighted by imports, these tariff increases were about 25%. This adds up to about 0.6% of GDP. So this is the loss, the yearly loss, as long as the tariffs remain in place, and we saw that these effects are pretty persistent, that these tariffs are causing to the US consumers, the equivalent of 0.6% of GDP. So next we can move to producers. And for producers, as I mentioned, in order to make the similar calculation, you care about what's the share of exports in GDP and what's the increase in the producer prices that's coming thanks to the fact that the US consumers are buying more US made goods and potentially increasing the prices of these goods. This is something that's much harder to measure directly in the data as I just presented. So this is a case in which what we do is an estimation that uses a model of the economy, a general equilibrium model as it's called. So we take a model that represents the different sectors and regions of the US economy. Importantly, because we are talking about producers that may see the cost of their imports increase due to the tariffs, the model includes input and output linkages. That is the fact that some sectors like cars use steel as an input. Steel is being taxed. And because of that, the cost of making cars in the US goes up, which is bad for producers. So we use a model in order to quantify the effects of the tariffs, incorporating some of the previous responses that I have shown. And through the model, we estimate an increase in the producer prices of about 1%, which multiplied by the 13% share in US GDP leads to a 0.13% increase in benefits to producers. So producers are making more money because they are getting protected. We estimate this number to be every year about 0.13% of GDP. Now, I mentioned there is a third component dancing around, which is the tariff revenue. This cost to consumers is tariffs. These tariffs are going to the government, and the government is perhaps rebating this back to the consumers. We see this sharp increase in tariffs. So this is something that in tariff revenue, this is something that we need to bring into the analysis. And what we do is to combine these three measurements that I just mentioned of the cost to consumers in the first column here, the benefit to US producers in the second column, and the government revenue in the third column. It is a theorem from neoclassical economics that when you add up these three numbers, you get the effects or the total impact on the US economy. The first number was a 0.6% of GDP loss, which evaluated at the basis of the 2017 US GDP is about $114 billion lost to consumers. This is offset by the gain to producers of 24 billion. and further offset by the tariff revenue of 65 billion. You add up these three, and you get a net loss to the US economy of 0.13% of GDP, which is 25 billion US dollars. So this is the total cost to the US that we estimate per year due to the trade war. And this is not a large number. So this is 0.30. I mean, it is, these are $25 billion, but relative to GDP, it's not a particularly perhaps large number. You can say that perhaps the losses to the consumers are, much larger, and they are pretty much offset by the effects on US producers and tariff revenue. Okay. Now, I mentioned that the benefit to producers in part depends on the retaliation. And we do see that producers export less when China retaliates against the US. So here we have the same type of figure that I showed before, only that in the horizontal axis, what we have is the months relative to the tariffs imposed by China, relative to the time of enactment of the tariffs imposed by China. And what do we see is that each time that China imposes tariffs, the exports fall, and they fall by kind of a similar amount to how much the US imports fall. That means that the US exporters are being are exporting less as a response, as a result of China protecting its own economy with tariffs. So then what we can do is incorporate this into our analysis, into our model, and give you a number that takes into account the difference between the trade war with and without retaliation. And the difference is essentially what happens to the producers. And we estimate that the effect of this retaliation is not really that large. The trade war led to a loss to, the trade war led to a benefit to US producers of about 0.13% of GDP. But in the absence of retaliation, had the Chinese government not retaliated against the US, this benefit would have been bigger, but not much bigger. Would have been, in our calculations, about 0.17% of GDP. Therefore, in the absence of this retaliation, the losses to the US would have been smaller. Instead of a 25 billion loss, it would have been a 16 billion loss. Still, a number that's closer to zero, but not enough to make it a gain to the US. So this is, in conclusion, what we find in terms of the aggregate effects. A large loss to consumers, or a relatively larger loss to consumers, offset by benefits to producers and by government revenue. Part of the effect on producers is explained by the retaliation. We can also take this total effect, these red lines that I have presented before, and make it clear that most of the effect of the trade war on the US economy is coming from the China waves, namely the US tariffs on China, as opposed to the US tariffs on other countries, which also were part of the trade war, broadly speaking, and broadly defined. Products such as steel were tariffed regardless of the origin. Like, Canadian steel was taxed when entering the US. So that was part of our previous calculation, but really most of it was these orange bars here are very close to the red bars, are telling you that the taxes on China are really explaining most of what happened in the trade war. Okay. So that's it for the aggregate effects. And now I will move to the second and relatively shorter part of my presentation, which has to do with regional impacts of the trade war. And of course, the trade war was in the news a lot, and part of this news were about local economies that were differentially affected by the trade war based on what they were producing. So, for example, here you see a title saying that in a Pennsylvania steel town, the tariff is a winner because since the steel was taxed, then different regions or cities in Pennsylvania that are specialized in steel are better off. But of course, there are other regions. Whirlpool, which is a US company, then perhaps didn't benefit as much because it uses steel as an input. And then wherever this Whirlpool headquarters is located, or the plants are located, may experience a loss. This has to do with the US tariffs, but there were also similar news about the retaliatory tariffs, the tariffs from China. China famously targeted mostly agricultural products. The US is a big exporter of soy to the US, but the US is a big agricultural producer in general. So different agricultural towns were affected by the Chinese tariffs and by tariffs from other countries. There are different examples here. And one that perhaps got like quite a bit of press was the case of the US whiskey, American whiskey, which was targeted essentially for being a very symbolic product that the US producers and leaving some particular towns that are, whiskey is producing in some places. In Kentucky, for example, there are places that are specialized in producing whiskey. So these places were affected by these tariffs that were targeting this particular product for, in this case, symbolic reasons, if you want. But there were other products as well. Soy, which is a big export from the US to China, and largely produced in North Dakota, were affected. The production of soy was affected by these tariffs. So what do we do is let's look at the regional effects of these tariffs. And how do we do that? So here we have a map of the US counties. There are about 3,000. And what we show here in darker colors are the US counties that received more protection. What does it mean that a county received more protection? It's sectors that receive protection, not counties. But you can translate the protection of sectors into protection of counties by looking at the industrial structure of different counties. And sure enough, you see that in areas of the Rust Belt, in Michigan or Pennsylvania and Ohio, these are places that traditionally have heavy industry or machinery, and these are sectors that, as I mentioned, were protected by the US government, and therefore the places themselves receive some protection. Also some places in the South that make consumer products, also in the West Coast, electronic equipment that receives some protection appears as being protected. And here, something that you see right away, which is the point of what I'm gonna mention very quickly, is that these states are also, swing states. These are the states that are politically, or there have been politically over the last elections more divided. These were the states where these tariffs tended to protect the industries more. Now let's do the same exercise for the China tariffs. And you see that the retaliatory tariffs, the tariffs that China and other countries, but mostly China imposed on the US, have a very different structure. So now the areas that we see as being darker shades of red are these areas in the most fertile regions of the US, the Corn Belt and areas of the Great Plains. These are the agricultural producers, the most fertile areas of the US. These are the ones that were attacked the most by the foreign tariffs, the areas that received the most of the retaliation. So then one exercise that we do in the paper, and another of our main results, is to look at how this pattern of US tariffs and of retaliatory tariffs relate to how each of these places voted in the 2016 election. So what we see here is another representation of the previous map. So maps are beautiful, but also have a lot of information in them, and they are hard to process. So here what we see on the horizontal axis is the vote share of each county in the US for the Republican Party in 2016. So places that are to the right, counties that are to the right, are counties that voted more for Trump, and counties that are more to the left are counties that voted less for Trump and more for Clinton in the 2016 presidential election. And on the vertical axis, what we have in this solid line is the US tariff. And what do we see? We see a pattern that I hinted at before. We see that the US tariffs tend to be relatively larger in counties. I mentioned it before for states, but you see it at the county level, in counties that happen to be in the middle of the voting distribution. That is, counties that are neither extremely Republican, nor counties that were extremely Democrat in 2016, counties that were kind of in between. In contrast, the retaliatory tariffs, the tariffs from China, have a very different structure. They are strictly increasing with the Republican vote. That is, places that are more heavily Republican, and these are typically more agricultural places as well, received most of the retaliation, most of the retaliatory tariffs from China. So this is a way of representing how the tariff changes of the trade war related to how each place voted. And in particular, the pattern of the US tariffs is interesting in the light of what's called in political science as the median voter theorem, which says that in order to win elections, there is an incentive of politicians of target the median voter. That is the voter that if you were to line up everyone in the economy according to their political preferences for one candidate or the other, the median will be the one that will be just in the middle of that distribution of how much you like one place or the other. Here, if you do the same with counties, if you were to line up all the counties in the US from the least to the most Republicans, in order to win elections, then you will have incentives to improve the condition of those that are closer to being median, those that are closer to being a swing voter. And I don't know what was in the mind of the policymakers where they imposed the tariffs, but this suggests that if there was some strategic reason behind them, it may have been that they were targeting the particular products in order to protect more counties that were closer to being the median, and therefore more important to decide an election. The rationale for the tariff for the Chinese tariffs is also not easy to grasp in general, but this suggests that they were targeting more Republican places. So now this is how tariffs relate to the vote. The thing that we can do is, well, let's try to look through the lens of our analysis how the US tariffs and the Chinese tariffs affected Republican versus Democratic places differentially. And I will capture all that information in this graph, then show you one more graph related to this, and then conclude. So there is a lot of information in this figure. So let me go over it slowly. What we are showing is different. Each of these points, or each of these bubbles, represents a county. On the horizontal axis, for each of these counties, we have what our model predicts was the income effect of this county if the only tariffs had been the US tariffs. And on the vertical axis, we have what our model predicts is the effect of these tariffs, counting both the US tariffs and the retaliation. If a bubble is on the 45-degree line, it means that the retaliatory tariff, that is the Chinese tariff, had basically no effect on this county. Whereas the farther down it goes, it means that the Chinese tariff affected this county more. Moreover, each of these bubbles has a different color, ranging from red, that is extremely Republican, to blue, which means extremely Democratic. Now, what do we see? What's the pattern that we see? We see that, well, first we see that all of these bubbles are below the 45-degree line, meaning that the Chinese tariffs, naturally what they did was to lower the real income of every place in the US. But what we see is this big tail of red bubbles here, of red counties, that is counties that were more heavily Republican. That is, this is saying that the Chinese tariffs actually affected, as I mentioned in the previous graph, the Republican counties more, and therefore reduced the wages of these counties relatively more. As predicted by our model, they had an effect of up to 1% if some particular counties. For example, I'm highlighting here Barnes in North Dakota, which is a heavily red county and also a heavy producer of soy. Therefore, a county that was taxed very highly by the Chinese, and that, as predicted by our model, had a big reduction in real income. Another place that I am highlighting is Bourbon, Kentucky. So Bourbon, Kentucky, I guess what it produces is pretty obvious. And it was also a county that received a pretty big reduction in wages as predicted by the model. Allegheny in Pennsylvania, this is where Pittsburgh is a steel town. We have Democratic places, New York, LA is over here, that were relatively affected less. So to conclude, we are answering in this figure by how much the different places were affected by the trade war, by the US and by the China tariffs, as a function of how they voted initially. And I am summarizing all this information in two lines, a line at the top that has only the US tariffs, and a solid line below that has the full war tariffs, including the US tariffs and the retaliation. So what do we see? We see that, as I mentioned before, the retaliation lowered real income for every county in the US, but relatively more for the counties that were heavily Republican, counties that had a vote share between 60% and 100% in favor of Trump in the 2016 elections, experienced a bigger decline in real income due to the retaliation. And with that, I will conclude. There are other things that we do in this paper. Of course, there has been and there is an ongoing body of research on the trade war that tackles very, a wide range of outcomes at the local, aggregate, and international levels, some of which I'm also working on. And here, what we did was what we did and what I presented today was sort of a first step into getting at some of the bigger picture facts of the trade war. What did we find? Large and sustained declines in imports and exports in response to the tariffs of the US and China. We find that the import prices from China before tariffs, the prices that the country pays excluding the tariffs, did not fall. This complete pass-through of tariff to tariff inclusive prices means that for the US as a whole, through the lens of at least these forces that we are considering, there was no benefit from the trade war. We estimate a relatively small negative aggregate effect, 0.1% of GDP, but the larger consumer loss that was offset by producer benefits. These effects are larger, the distributional effects are larger when you look across different counties in the US. The US, as I just mentioned near the end, offer higher protection to the more electorally competitive counties, but Republican counties were in the end the most negatively affected due to the retaliation. These were our main conclusions. Of course, there are many caveats as in any analysis, and perhaps the larger ones were that we excluded from our analysis additional effects that have to do with the dynamics of accumulation of capital in the economy, capital and other inputs such as knowledge and technologies. That is, we are not considering how the trade war affected aggregate capital accumulation, technology transfer between the US and China. And we also didn't consider the impact of the tariffs on the investment climate and uncertainty. Famously, the stock market had very big swings around the time of these tariffs, suggesting that there are uncertainty-related forces that we are not capturing. But with these caveats in mind, these were our main conclusion from the analysis, and thank you for listening.
So thank you, Pablo. And thank you, Scott and Lori. The department is very grateful for your support. Speaking of support, we need the support of all of our alumni to retain faculty and to train students. If you are not involved with the department, please consider becoming involved. Mentor a student, give a presentation about what you do in your job in one of your classes, interview a Bruin for an internship or a job, and join the board of visitors. Thank you again, Pablo, Scott, and Lori, and many thanks to all of our alumni. Best wishes to everyone for the summer.